Well, thank you so much, Kip. It is a great pleasure to be with you all today. I've missed the opportunities to have the face-to-face and interacting, but hopefully we are on the back end of all of this, and that we will be back together in a normal state by the end of this year. So at least I'm very hopeful for that. As Kip said early on, I'm an economist by training, and I look at these data from kind of the 40,000 foot view. But one of the things that is very true with any economic data, and especially real estate data, is that specific statistics or trends can be interpreted in many different ways. And I'm a huge believer that the insights and the understandings of people who are on the ground dealing day to day with buyers and sellers has a huge impact on how you properly interpret the numbers going forward. So my goal today is to talk a little bit about the annual housing forecast that we released back in October, and then to discuss some of the changes that I've seen since that time and how I think that will affect us going forward here in 2021. For those of you who have not yet picked up your copies of the housing forecast, there are copies that are available at the KCRAR office, and there will be more copies available soon. So I'd encourage you to pick those up. We have realtors all across the state who will use those forecast publications in listing presentations, in relocation packets, in other materials that they use to provide you all are the true experts of what's going on in your local market. But sometimes with some outsiders, it's really helpful to have an objective outside. This isn't just a realtor who's trying to promote their business, but somebody who's looked at it from a non-financial, I'm not getting a commission out of any of this basis. And it can be useful to help support some of the things that you're telling buyers and sellers about the market. So again, we'd encourage you to pick those up. And we're very grateful to the sponsors who've made those beautiful publications available. Security First Title and Fidelity Bank are wonderful sponsors, and they've basically covered all of the costs of both the graphic design and the printing of those publications. So again, we'd encourage you to use them and to thank those sponsors for that. And then we also want to thank the partnership that we've had with the Kansas Association of Realtors, and through them, the Kansas City Regional Association of Realtors and the Heartland MLS. Many of you may know that for over a decade now, we have prepared monthly MLS statistical reports for the state of Kansas. And to make that possible, KAR helped facilitate an agreement whereby we have access to the multiple listing services across all of the different realtor boards in the state of Kansas, including the Heartland MLS. And then we take all of those data and we make them talk to one another, which isn't always as easy as it seems. Any of you who have been involved in a change of MLS vendors know that process can be a complicated one and a difficult one. We make all of them talk together and then are able to produce statistics. And it's because of that we have the data necessary to be able to do these annual housing forecasts. So we're very grateful for that partnership. So back in 2019, we put together our forecast for 2020. And this is a slide that came from my presentation at that time. And I said, when we talked about the labor market and the mortgage market, which are the fundamentals that really underlie what will happen in the single-family housing market, I said, fundamentals are really, really solid. Mortgage financing is widely available and incredibly cheap. There's no way interest rates could get any lower than what we're seeing. And I said labor markets are fairly healthy. But I also said at the time, it somehow felt like maybe there was a demon lurking over our shoulders and that all of that could change very quickly. I had no clue that this year is what we'd be talking about. And of course, change quickly it did. As soon as the pandemic hit and the shutdowns came on, unemployment rates spiked tremendously. And while Kansas City, which is the blue line on this chart, wasn't quite as extreme as the United States as a whole, still incredibly high unemployment rates. And you'll notice much higher than it was at the peak following in the midst of the Great Recession. We're much better off now. Unemployment rates have dropped tremendously. The latest numbers that we have for Kansas City are 4.9%, which a lot of years ago we might have said, oh, that's full employment. We're doing great. But we came up from an area where we were down closer to 3% unemployment rate. So there's still room for improvement there, and it's still really struggling. Where I think we see more of the stress is through the jobs numbers. Now, these are two different ways that we measure what's going on in the labor market. The unemployment rate, we look at households. We ask people, do you have a job or are you currently looking for work? And the unemployment rate is the percentage of the people in the labor force, people who are either working or looking for work. What percentage of those don't have a job? But that's focused on households and where people live. Somebody living in Lawrence who works in Kansas City would show up in the Kansas City unemployment rate. Would show up in the Lawrence unemployment rate statistics because they live in Lawrence. The jobs numbers, on the other hand, focus on where the business is located. We actually sometimes call this the establishment survey. And this chart shows the year-over-year change in the total number of jobs. And again, the darker blue line is the Kansas City metropolitan area. And we can see here, again, the most recent data available are November, and it's down 3.8% compared to where we were in November of 2019. So really severe job losses, and you can see the level of job losses that we have. Those declines during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009 were the most severe job losses that we had seen since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the job losses that we saw in the spike following the shutdowns in March were even more severe than that. And right now, we're still at levels of declines that are as bad as we had back during the Great Recession. And so while in one level it feels like things may be getting a little bit better, we've seen some sharp increases in employment, if you will, we're still far, far below where we had been. And so the WSU Center for Economic Development and Business Research recently, just last week, in fact, revised their forecast for the Kansas City metropolitan area employment. Originally, they had forecast that 2021 would have jobs of 1.064 million jobs in the Kansas City metro area. They've raised that a little bit, in part because 2020 ended up a little bit better, or looks like it's going to end up better than what we expected. But that 1.3% job growth that they're forecasting for 2021 in the Kansas City metro area really has to be taken in the context of that 3.9% drop in 2020. And that figure of 1.06 million jobs in 2021 is the lowest that we've seen since 2016. And so that's a really, really challenging situation. One of the other things that I think we have to keep in mind with respect to the job market is that it's been very unequal in who's been affected. And one of the things that I think has surprised us, but in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, is that home buyers have been relatively unaffected by the job losses in the pandemic. In many respects, the people who were most affected, hit the worst by the downturn in the labor markets, were people who were less likely to be homeowners, more likely to be in the renter market. And so what Kip was talking about before in terms of, questions about the eviction moratoria and those things, those are going to it's going to be really concerning at the worst, interesting, maybe a better word, what will happen whenever those eviction moratoria are lifted. How will we see waves of evictions and so forth happening? Because I think it's that side of the housing market, if you will, the renter market, that's been much more negatively impacted by the job losses than the single-family owner-occupied market. For the most part, those of us who have jobs where you can effectively swap and move remote have been much less impacted than those who have service sector jobs or manufacturing jobs where physical presence is much more important. So that's where we are with the labor market. And before I go on and talk about mortgage financing, were there any questions there that had popped up? I just kind of want to make sure that I'm addressing things as we go.
No questions at this time.
Okay, well, remember, I prefer an interactive environment. This is a little bit weird to kind of just talk to a camera, but so feel free to bring up your questions and ask them as we go along. So labor markets, if I had to summarize all of that, is that I actually am a little bit fearful that things are going to be a little bit tougher in 2021 than we in the housing market and certainly the owner-occupied market have seen so far. One of the things that we know happens with the labor market situation is that when one segment of the market struggles for an extended period of time, eventually it begins to filter in and roll into others. And so I'm fearful that it's going to be a long, tough slog to really recover in the labor market sector, and that we should expect that even the job growth that is forecast for next year may not translate into a real push of additional demand in the housing market. And we'll talk about that more when I talk about my housing forecast. Mortgage rates, on the other hand, they dropped from what we said was it's impossible for rates to go lower, where we dropped down with the 30-year fixed mortgage rate now still averaging just below 3%. And that's just a stunningly low number. It's not really being driven by the pandemic itself. It rather is being driven by the Federal Reserve's response to the pandemic. Prior to all of this, the Fed had been in the process of unwinding all of the extraordinary activity of purchase of mortgage-backed securities that they had been doing in the wake of the financial crisis back in 2008. And as they'd been unwinding, basically what had happened is they'd purchased lots and lots of mortgage-backed securities, and that caused 30-year fixed mortgage rates to decline for us in the primary mortgage market. What the Fed had been doing is not having new purchases of mortgage-backed securities and letting the ones that were maturing roll off their books. So they were easing their way out of that type of activity. When the pandemic hit, they began to renew their purchases again, so that they again were actively buying mortgage-backed securities. And that caused mortgage rates to decline once again. And again, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate is now below a 5.1 ARM in nationwide. And so that's a stunning situation. What does the Mortgage Bankers Association forecast for the 30-year fixed mortgage rate? Their forecast is that by the end of this year, mortgage rates will rise just slightly to 3.2%, and by the end of next year, up to only 3.6%. So Kip was talking about rates below 5%. That's not even on the Mortgage Bankers Association's radar screen. And if you asked me, I would say a 5% rate would be a really good, low, normal level for mortgage rates in a world where you have solid economic growth, low inflation, and most importantly, nothing funny going on in financial markets, which is really where we've been for 10 years with some extraordinary interventions in financial markets. when we get to a place where we have mortgage rates that are around 5%, I'll say we're past everything that we've been going to, and that will still be a good, solid, low level of mortgage rates for housing markets. But that's not in the foreseeable future right now. There has been some tightening in underwriting standards here, particularly with that bump in refinancing, the additional fee. But again, I think most of what has driven the incredible increase in demand that we've seen here over the last half of the year is the households that are reasonably well off from a labor market perspective. Hey, I've been able to pivot my job. I'm not so worried about being laid off. Oh my goodness, I will never in my life see rates this low again. This is the opportunity where I can stretch into things that I never imagined that I could buy. And so that has driven a spike in demand that I don't think any of us fully anticipated when all of this started. So, as you all know, the home sales, the last half of this year in particular, have just been spectacular. It's been really stunning to see, especially in the last quarter. The blue bars on here are the official numbers that the Heartland MLS reports for all of the Kansas City metro area and outlying regions. It's just everything in the Heartland MLS. And then the orange line on here is a moving average. So I try to smooth through the seasonality that we see and try and say, how is everything balanced out if we kind of look at underlying trends. And you can see on that we had this very slight dip early in the summer that related to some of the concerns about the pandemic. As Kip said, we were very fortunate that in Kansas and Missouri that the states declared real estate as essential activities, and I think that was a very wise move. Imagine for households that were dealing with incredible stressful situations that needed to engage in real estate transactions, and they were in parts of the country where they were not allowed to avail themselves of the services that realtors provide. That was a very cruel thing for those local governments to have done to their citizens. The services that realtors provide are truly essential services, and so it was a wise move on the part of our local states to make that available. And one of the things where you can really see that impact is this is the month's supply numbers. And there are a lot of interesting things in this picture that I think are worth looking at. First of all, the orange line at the top is the United States month's supply. And so again, month's supply is our measure of balance in the housing market. What we do is we take the number of homes that are available for sale on the market. How many homes are active listings at the moment? And then we divide that number by the average pace of sales over the prior year. So if there were, say, 1,000 homes available for sale in a given market, and we were selling on average 200 homes a month, then we would say 1,000 divided by 200, that would be a 5 months supply. And so you can see there's a little bit of seasonality in here as home sales kind of pick up in the summer and as listings increase in anticipation of that in the late winter. But you'll notice there in the middle of the year that the U.S. as a whole saw a very sharp spike in month supply. And that reflected entirely the restrictions on realtor activities throughout many parts of the country because of the pandemic restrictions. And you just did not see that in the Kansas City area or in Kansas as a whole. And again, I think that reflects wise decisions. The other things that I want you to notice on here is that greenish shaded area reflects what we typically think of as a balanced market. Between a 4 and a 6 month supply, we typically think that's a market that favors neither sellers nor buyers. When we have inventories that are up above a 6 month supply, we think it's really flush. That may give a lot of market power to the buyers that are in the market. But when it gets below a 4 month supply, we start to think that it's favoring sellers and that sellers tend to maybe have more pressure and ability to influence what's going on in the market. Well, as you can see in the Kansas City area, we've been below a 4-month supply since 2015. And then this year, it's dropped even lower. In fact, at the end of December, as a market as a whole, across all price segments, all geographic regions, you averaged just a 1 month's supply. And even that, it's unheard of low levels of inventories. But even that doesn't capture how incredibly tight the market is. And so one of the ways that I've looked at this is I tried to segment the market. And I could only do this for the Kansas side of the Kansas City area because that's the only part of the market for which we have access to actual transaction level data where we can look and segment by the price. But in my experiences, what goes on in the Kansas side of the market pretty much mirrors the market as a whole. That the two sides are not dramatically different from one another. You wouldn't expect it to be in theory, and in practice, we don't seem to see that in the aggregate. And so I then just picked some arbitrary price points. I said, let's look at homes listed for $150,000 or lower. Homes listed between $150,000 and $300,000. Homes between $300,000 and $500,000, and then those homes that are listed above $500,000. Those are arbitrary price points. You could pick what you thought were different segments of the market that best fit things. You'd get very similar stories. But what I want you to see here is that the most, for that sweet spot, the most popular price ranged homes that the greatest number of buyers are interested in, that $150,000 to $300,000 price range. At the end of December, there was less than a half month's supply available. About a 50, it may be better to refer to days supply than it is to refer to a month's supply. Even in the more popular, but outside that central range, less than 150 or 350 to 100,000, still just about a 1 month supply. And then what's been most striking here over the past year is that for a lot of years, when I would come and we'd talk in that roundtable event in August that Kip was mentioning, and we talk about different segments of the market, and most of the market really tight, but we'd get up into the upper end of the market, say 750 above. The discussion would be how really it was much more of a buyer's market in that upper price range. Over the last year, that's really changed. And I think a lot of that has been driven by the incredibly low interest rates, that there are more and more households that are relatively affluent, stable labor market situation that are now able to stretch into price points that they never imagined that they'd be able to get into in the past. And so that has caused even that upper end of the market to move much closer to what we might consider to be a seller's market.
Hey, Stan?
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that's been interesting is we've been monitoring and looking at what's search criteria. And so search criteria has been going through the roof for office, home office, people searching for home gyms, people searching for pools. From what I understand, there's about a year to 2 year backlog in being able to get a pool installed in a property. And so, the search criteria has totally changed where, people want to be able to, if they're going to have to stay put and we're going to have to live with this or future pandemics or whatever the case is, that mindset has really changed and it's had a tremendous impact on the upper market.
Yeah, and all of those things require more square footage, and they're going to translate into higher price range of homes. So, very interesting. Do we have any questions there coming from people who are watching with us?
One person asked if you would repeat the predicted mortgage rate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The Mortgage Bankers Association's forecast, let me hop back here so I can see my notes on that and make sure I give you exactly the right number here. The forecast through the end of this year is 3.2%. And again, that's a forecast by the Mortgage Bankers Association. They do an annual, you can actually go to their website and you can look for the mortgage finance forecast, and they update it every month. And then through the end of 2022, Their forecast is below 3.6% for the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So what is our forecast for housing market activity? Well, I have to give a big caveat to this. I have not revised the forecast since we've had about the last 4 or 5 months of data that's come available here. And the end of 2020 was spectacularly strong. We ended up year to date, for the entire year, you ended up 3.9% in total home sales across the multiple listing service for 2020. My original projection was that there would be a slight decline, about a 1% decline to about 39,500. My reasoning for that was solely due to lack of inventory. Now, I have a question for all of you. Where on earth are you digging up these homes to sell? Because there just is nothing available on the market. I know that some of it must be happening of homes that are just selling so quickly that they're obviously homes are selling incredibly quickly, but maybe even homes that are selling before they're even formally listed. But that does mean you've got to find, you can't sell a home if somebody's not buying a home. If you can't give it to a buyer if somebody's not willing to sell. And so it's been incredible. And the level at which you've been able to find homes for people to buy is something that has just been incredible given the tight inventories. So the number that go ahead.
Yeah, one comment in there. I mean, it was, I think we were 5.8% over last year in total sales for December, and still we sold, and we had an inventory that was down 51%, yet we sold 1,000 more units. So I'm with you and sort of shaking my head, but I think what's changed is the consumer is more willing to look at properties that need work. And that wasn't the case when we went back, 2, 3, and 4 years ago. Everyone wanted turnkey. They were looking at a small footprint, and they weren't looking at a lot of square footage needs, and they wanted everything to be showroom ready. And so I think that's really where the big thrust is the consumer knows how tight the market is. Our agents are doing a great job educating them. And also somebody just popped up, we've got more new construction that is coming to the marketplace. So, hopefully that continued trend of new construction is going to guide us through and get a lot more done in 2021.
Yeah. So you will see there that I put up what was our original forecast of 39,080 units, which that says now down 7.6%. Originally, that was just down a little over 1% compared to last year. And it is, so if I have not done a formal revision of the forecast, it's really, really difficult in this kind of environment because everything is so unique. But my personal expectation is that what we will see is that home sales activity in 2021 will be level or down just slightly compared to 2020. I was kind of ballparking it maybe down to about 42,000 or 41,750, something like that. Just a very slight decline. And my reason for that is twofold, and it's still the same things that I had back in October when we originally released the forecast. Number one, I've always been more fearful about 2021 for labor market prospects and therefore demand in the housing market for potential home buyers. And I suspect that we may even see a little bit of so many people pushed into the market at the end of 2020 that there may be sort of an exhale that comes out. People who are trying to take advantage of those low rates we may have stolen a little bit from the future. And then number two, I still believe that inventories are constraining what we're able to do. And so even though you've been true miracle workers in coming up with homes for people to buy, it's still the case that it's harder to do that than it would be if we had inventory, a month supply that was around a 4-month supply or something. That we could then see a lot more. If we increase the number of active listings, we could see more sales there. So again, I don't have a formal revision to the forecast, but the qualitative nature of what we had before, which is a very slight decline next year, I think is still what I'm expecting at this point.
Hey, Stan, we did have a question about inflation.
Sure.
Bill had mentioned, I've always heard that a large federal government deficit will cause inflation to grow. Do you see that happening? There are concerns regarding inflation or hyperinflation?
The short answer to that is no. There are no concerns about inflation on the foreseeable horizon. And as soon as you hear economists start to say that definitively, be scared, because as soon as economists say anything with certainty, then they're guaranteed to be wrong. And so, seriously, the relationships, the Phillips curve relationships, and some of the things that we had between economic growth and inflation have really broken down over the last 20 years. And one of the areas where, the first place where we saw this sustained levels of very, very low interest rates and even potential deflation issues was in Japan. And they went to a place where they had essentially zero interest rates back in the early 1990s, following their kind of crash of their real estate and stock market. It's never changed for them. And there are so many pressures right now that are holding that back. I just don't foresee that in the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean in the next 2-3 years. We've got a lot of things that we've got to recover from before that becomes a concern.
Hey, Stan, there's also a question about, do your numbers include FSBOs or sales not going through MLS? And you also clarify what the data is, the entire metro on Missouri and Kansas. That one slide you were talking about was just the Kansas thing. So I want everybody to know that we are providing you the Missouri side data.
Right. So the yes. So to clarify here, we have direct access to the transactional level data for the Kansas side, but obviously you, as the Kansas City Regional Association of Realtors, have a fantastic staff and put together a wonderful set of statistics. Those are the statistics. Everything that we forecast for home sales activity and so forth is for the entire, not just the metro area, but everything that's in the Heartland MLS. And so the only times that it's restricted, I will always try and make that really explicitly clear. That one breakdown by price range is the only place on anything today that was different from that. And so it's important. Kansas City regional market is a regional market, and you have to look at both sides of the river and State Line Road in order to understand what's going on across that market.
You're not pulling any other additional FSBO.
Oh yes, and so. FSBOs are, no, all of these data are only data that are reported by a local MLS. I have not done it specifically for the Kansas City metro area, but in the past when I've looked at some of the other metro areas across Kansas, I've tried to compare certificate of value questionnaires. In the state of Kansas, every time a real estate transaction occurs, a questionnaire has to be filled out saying what was the sale price that goes to the state of Kansas. And when we compare kind of the transactions and the things that happen with certificate of values versus what's happening in the MLS system, the difference being primarily for sale by owners and some odd lot sales, commercial transactions go in there as well. They just move in lockstep. The correlation between those two is almost 100%. And most importantly, it hasn't changed dramatically over the last 15 years or so, meaning that we haven't seen a shift to for sale by owners in a dramatic way that might suggest that the underlying trends would be different if we included all real estate transactions. So while these only include transactions that are facilitated by a realtor, the underlying changes and trends very much match what happens with other transactions as well. That get that question well?
Yeah, I think so. And I will just add a very small disclaimer. We do encourage that solds that happen before a property is put into MLS are inputted by the realtors. So you do have some of that data where we've recorded a sold, but it was not actually in MLS at the time. So
That's
that might
right.
have that may have a small skewing factor to the data, but I mean it's less than probably a percentage point.
Yeah, no, the data, and some of that comes in through, you'll notice revisions every single month in the data, and it's reflecting additional transactions that, just because it was sold before it was formally listed, it still ends up in the MLS as, often with the list date, contract date, and sale date all the same day. So those do show up. So given these really tight inventories, it shouldn't be surprising that what we're seeing is really, really strong home price appreciation. Our forecast, which is pretty much straight on par for what we've been seeing since we released it, is home price appreciation of about 6.5% for this year and for the coming year. And you can see that's been continuing now for about 6 years of really, that's above average home price appreciation. Maybe 4 to 5% would be more of a standard trend for a solid market for Kansas City. But part of the reason for this really strong home price appreciation, above and beyond the tight inventories, is the fact that we are doing a little bit of catch up from what happened in the wake of the financial crisis, when home prices declined, not sharply, but somewhat across the Kansas City metro area. And I'll come back and I'll talk about this when I talk about building permits, but this is going to be an important piece in understanding what's happening with new home construction. So again, our forecast is for continued home price appreciation over the coming year at a very healthy clip. And finally, this is single-family building permits, and I included only single-family, not total building permits. So this does not include apartments. It does not include duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, just single-family homes, because those are the most likely ones to end up and translate into additional inventory in the single-family home buying market. And I thought it would be interesting to see kind of the trend since over the last 20 years, 21 years here. Back in the late 1990s and then into the early 2000s, we had permits that were averaging upwards of 1,000 permits a month prior to the onset of the financial crisis. And then, of course, the bottom dropped out and dropped down to a level of where we were down at about 250, 300 permits a month. Since then, there's been relatively healthy gains. You're still talking on average about 500 permits a month. And so it's been a struggle for new home construction to really pick up and accelerate to what would be even replacement levels in the market. And I'm going to go back to the previous slide here, and I should have included more years. Go back to, say, 2005 and 2006. Prior to 2014, home price appreciation in the Kansas City area was either flat or declining for about 5 or 6 years. And that's for existing homes, for people, the same home selling over the course of different periods of time. During that same time, the cost of building a new home continued to increase at pretty healthy clips, even as existing home prices were declining. And so as a result, it became more and more difficult for new homes to compete with existing homes, especially in the more modest price ranges. But since we've been seeing this relatively strong appreciation over the past, if it continues here next year the way we expect, that will have been almost 8 years of really pretty strong home price appreciation. That's giving us place where we can really start to see some meaningful increases in new home construction, especially at some of the more modest price points. say below a $500,000 price point, that allows more buyers to potentially get in there, which hopefully will help to ease some of the inventory concerns, just like what Kip was discussing earlier. And so our projection here, this was our projection back in October, that 2020 we'd end up at 5,560. Right now, through November, Kansas City area has seen 5,502 permits through the end of November. And so that's really right on pace. We expect to be a little bit, our forecast is probably a little bit low for what we expected. But then a really, really strong gain this next year, up to about 7,000 units. And that may say, oh, wow, that's a big increase. Remember, that's still far below the 10 to 12,000 permits per year that we saw in the early 2000s, and even well below the 8 to 10,000 permits that we saw in the late 1990s. So again, strong increases in home construction activity that we're forecasting for the Kansas City area next year. But that's something that's really needed, and it's really being unleashed because of the tight inventories and the home price appreciation in the existing home market that makes it a little bit easier to build in those different price points. So that then is the summary of our forecast. Like I said, our overall forecast here for 2021 is qualitatively very similar to what we had originally. We haven't formally redone it, but modest decline in home sales this coming year, really big increase in permitting activity, and very, very strong home price appreciation. I would note that we do forecasts for all of the major markets across the state of Kansas, and we do that for the state as a whole. And our forecast actually, just so that you know, our actual forecast, the actual number for the state of Kansas was about 44,040, so almost right on spot with sales. Well under with sales, but our permits forecast seems to be right on pace with what we're expecting for single-family permits for the state of Kansas. So with that, I want to thank our sponsors again, but then I want to answer questions. So I think I'm going to turn off my screen share so that we can see each other a little bit easier. So were there the questions? Oops, Kip, I think you're still muted.
This is my first Zoom meeting ever.
It's amazing how we keep doing it, and we know it, and we'll do it right after somebody else does it, right?
Amen. Yes, Judy had asked, does your data compare all ownership changes in residential real estate to MLS sales? Again, I think this relates to that question of FSBOs, but it also, essentially you have deeds that are filed that reflect a transaction, and then you have MLS sales. And all we are including in the MLS sales are single-family homes. So anything else that's in there, we're not including. And we are not including anything that would be commercial transactions that might show up in the Register of Deeds data. We're not including anything that would be again, for sale by owner. You also get weird things, right? If I decided to transfer a 2-foot strip of land from my property to my neighbor so that they could do something on their land and not be in violation of zoning, those aren't included in what we're doing. But again, our past experience is the underlying trends are not impacted by those changes. Yeah, I think when we've looked at it historically, it accounts for less than 5%. Of all transactions.
And most importantly, the movements, when they go up and down, move in just lockstep with one another. They don't seem to have dramatic differences over different parts of the economic cycle, for instance.
Judy was also asking if there's an impact of Zillow or iBuyers. I'll turn that over to you. From my perspective, we really haven't seen a major play for iBuyers in the marketplace, and it hasn't had a major impact. My larger concerns have actually been the erosion of inventory by companies like Airbnb, which are taking properties really out of the sellable market and becoming individual investment vehicles for homeowners. And so that erodes. I mean, nationally, Airbnb has 600,000 Airbnbs. So that's 600,000 properties, completely gone from inventory all over the U.S. I'm not going to say whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but it has an impact.
Right.
The other thing that has an impact is the companies like Blackstone. So there has been, over the last 5 to 6 years, and Stan and I have talked about this a lot, is they're buying up, hundreds, if not thousands of properties per year within our market. And that has a cumulative effect because those are single family properties that are being turned into rental and will not return to the normal turnover of a 5 to 7 year period that we would see if they were in the hands of a single family owner. And so that has an impact on inventory rates as well, but still not seeing very much activity in iBuyers.
You bring up a couple of interesting points there, Kip, and one of the things that I actually hadn't thought about before is, we kind of say, oh, typical homes will sell and turn over again in 7 years or so. There's a range, 5 to 10 years. I'm not sure that I know or I've seen what is the typical turnover rate for renter occupied real estate. So if you talk about single family homes that are owned either whether by a mom and pop owner or by an investor, a large investment group, how rapidly those turn over or not. That'd be an interesting question to know how quickly they turn over. But that's one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that regardless of whether it's owner occupied or whether it's renter occupied, it still, whenever it transacts, it still is a potential sale for a realtor. And so it's a slightly different way that the buyer may be looking at it, but that's an important piece of that. And the turnover one's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it, and so I'll have to think about that more deeply.
Yeah, I think it's a much longer period when it's owned by a rental company or a large company, and the detriment is that they hold that property until there's neglect or there's a huge change in the rental market, and they dump the properties back on after they've pulled the equity that they had gained. And so we may have a lot of deferred repairs on those properties when they're put back onto the market, which could bring down property values in a specific neighborhood if they're used as comps and done in mass. I mean, it'd have to be a property dumping 1,000 units to have an impact, but if they were in a tight geographic area, it certainly can. I experienced that during the recession in Las Vegas when I was there, and it certainly had an impact.
Yeah, certainly anytime that you have large volumes of properties that kind of get moved all at once, that can have real dramatic impacts. And the mom and pop, I think sometimes we overlooked a lot of the mom and pop market, and there was an awful lot of it out there, and you just didn't notice it because they were onesie twosies, right? But that didn't mean that it was a significant part of the market. Matter of fact, the two markets in Kansas where people would notice it and pay attention to it were what they called the kiddie condos, the apartments that were near campus that mom and dad would buy so their kids would have a place to stay while they were in college. And that used to be a really big part of those markets, and it's not as much anymore. Regarding Zillow and the iBuyers and things, in this market, I've always been somebody who advocates the use of a realtor as a seller. The thing that I think people don't appreciate and understand when they go in to be a for sale by owner is that, if everything goes great, fine, no big deal. But real estate transactions are very complicated transactions, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And I always encourage all of you that the right way to market to me is I want to know, what are you going to do to make sure that deal closes? That I can figure out how to price my home. I can figure out how to paint my walls beige, put in some annuals, and take stuff out of my closets, right? There's a lot of self-help things for that side of things. But what happens when something goes on with an inspection or with a question about the buyer's financing, and all of that deal falls through? That, to me, is where an experienced realtor really brings a lot of value to the transaction. But I've always been an advocate from the seller's perspective of use a realtor. You're foolish if you don't use a good realtor. From a buyer's perspective, I was always a little bit more ambivalent. I said, you ought to get the protection of having that buyer agency relationship, but you want to make sure you've got a good relationship and so forth. In today's market, I don't see how you can buy without having a relationship with the realtor. And the being able to go on, whether it's realtor.com or Zillow or Trulia or anything, any of those online services, the problem is by the time you see something there, it's probably gone in this market. Where I'm really concerned and disturbed, and this is not just in real estate, it's in a lot of different areas, is some of these online tech company type things really insinuating themselves into the middle of transactions without actually providing any genuine value to either party, to the buyer, to the seller, and essentially putting themselves in a position as a gatekeeper and then trying to extract commission out of that process. They're not saving money for a buyer in that process. They're not saving money for a realtor. They're simply taking it out of the hands of the people who still have to do the real work and the real value that's being provided. And so I don't know how you resolve that issue, but I have concerns about those things where they get insinuated as essentially you've got to pay a finder's fee to them in order to engage in the transaction. And so you may have different feelings about that, but to me, pay the commission where the real work is being done. So any other questions that we had? I know we're right at the end of our time, and you can't be doing these deals if you're sitting listening to me, so you need to get out and keep closing those deals. So any other questions? I'm going to take that as a no. So, well, thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate it. I'm looking so much forward to being able to come up to Kansas City and be there in person with all of you and interact. But in the meantime, hopefully this has been useful and interesting. And once again, I would encourage you to download, to go and pick up hard copies of our housing forecast. Those are available at the KCRAR office. And you can also download a copy of our presentation and a video of today's presentation I'll make available on the Center for Real Estate website, which is wichita.edu/real estate. So any closing comments, Kip?
No, I just want to thank you, Stan. It's always a real pleasure to have you addressing our group, and the information you provide is invaluable to us. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful day.